Our last session in the Hotel Tatra, that I think was a very good host, and I think it was a very nice place. So let me introduce Sarah Atkinson, professor of screen media, that will hold the next lecture. Actually, not me to introduce Sarah, but Tit. Please, Tit, go.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will say a couple of more words about Sarah. So it is our great pleasure to introduce Sarah Atkinson, and an esteemed scholar and a prolific author. Sarah currently works as a professor of screen media at King's College, which she joined in 2015. Having previously worked in Brighton, University of Central Lancashire, and University of Salford. Sarah Atkinson holds a PhD, a practice-based PhD, which in our context is very important, in interactive cinema from 2009. So really kind of pioneering in this area. She has led 3 prestigious AHRC projects and serves as a co-editor of Convergence, the international journal of research into new media technologies. So one of the flagship journals in the area dating back to 1995. Sarah has published widely on the impact of digital technologies on film and media and audiences and screen production and industries. So a plethora of different expertise. She has also made extensive use of practice-based methodologies. And so join me in welcoming Professor Sarah Atkinson.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for having me at this event. It's wonderful to be here amongst such esteemed colleagues and such a wonderful project that you're all involved with. So today I'm going to be talking about the transformative impacts of virtual worlds and spatial computing on production practices and audience engagement with film, cinema and screen media. So the talk is entitled Virtual Horizons, Shaping the Screen Industries of the Future. But first of all, before I dive into that, I thought I'd just give you a very quick tour through my previous publications and interests so you can see the background that I'm coming from to these different topics. So my first monograph was very much looking at how digital technologies and networked media were impacting upon film and cinema audiences and spectatorship practices. That was published in 2014. So it was looking at the advent of the internet and how that was feeding into audiences' understandings and engagements with film texts. Then from the other angle, I've looked at production practices. So my second monograph in 2018 was looking at the pivotal moment where film production was transitioning into a data process. So it took one film as a case study in 2012, which was Sally Potter's film Ginger and Rosa. And I interviewed every single person who was involved in making that film, some of whom were working in purely digital forms, some of whom were still using paper-based systems, and some of whom are using hybrid formats. It was one of the first UK independent films to be shot using an ARRI Alexa. So they were really there grappling at the forefront of what it was like to integrate digital technologies into all aspects of the production process. Of course, they were already there for editing and post-production, but not so much for production. So that was an ethnographic study. And then further studies into audience behaviours around cinematic text through a major project called Live Cinema, which has resulted in books and publications and consultations with different bodies where it seems quite an oxymoronic statement to say that the live comes into cinema arenas, but it was very much looking at that intersection. So I'm always very interested in moments of transition, moments of intersection and moments of change. So it's very exciting times at the moment. My latest co-authored monograph I'll talk about a little at the end of the presentation because that links to some of the themes of today. And so these are some of the reports that I've consulted on. So beyond academia itself to the industry and to the sector, I've worked with organisations to understand and wrangle with these new technologies, their terminologies and what they might mean for audiences and how to translate them for audience groups. So, as was mentioned, I have engaged in practice-based methods throughout my whole academic career. My PhD was practice-based, but I've since gone on to produce things like documentaries and peer-reviewed video essays as forms of critique and interrogation into the screen media practices, and always very interested in the impact of new technologies on these arenas. So one of my video essays very much looked at cinematic virtual reality and how that had been communicated previously in films. I've looked at how smartphones have infected and inflected upon filmmaking aesthetics and what we see on screen. And also then I have an angle of my research is very much focused on gender and gender inequities and gender problems within the screen industries and on film. So this latest series called Double Takes is a series of short micro video essays that look at moments of where women performers have somehow suffered at the hands of their director in the performance and the performance making practice. So they're very, very short videos, each telling a different story of a different woman performer retelling an account of what it was like to be on set for a particular moment on screen. And then my latest book, which is yet to be published, this will come out next year, Mixed Realities, Gender and Emergent Media, looks at, through a series of over 140 interviews with women, non-binary and trans practitioners, the lived realities of what it's like to work in a transitional media space, what makes them open, what makes them accessible, and also what might make them problematic and challenging. But what was unearthed through that were a series of stories from creators, and particularly women creators, who'd been ignored in the history of virtual reality and virtual media, despite making incredible contributions to the form and its evolution and its development, being written out of history or being marginalised in some way. So that resulted in an exhibition, so another practice-based format of dissemination very recently in London on the Strand, so a very high-profile area. I used that platform to bring forward new art from creators who hadn't had a platform elsewhere, as well as charting some of those contributions that came out of the book project. So it's called Glow Illuminating Innovation, and these are the different places on the Strand where we had different augmented reality, highly experimental artworks for audiences to engage in. And the general public, using their smartphone devices, they can access sculptures and animations that these new artists had created. And then through a very visible shop front window, I showcased some of the contributions that women had made over time to virtual reality and virtual worlds. So just a few examples. This is Nicole Stenger. She created the first virtual reality interactive piece using Jaron Lanier's headset and data glove there, but she's not someone who's very well known or recognised. The piece was called Angels. It was made in 1989. I'm sure lots of you have heard of Jaron Lanier, but not many people will have heard of Nicole Stenger. But it was the content that she produced that helped to drive that technology forward to inform its development. And then there's Margaret Minsky, who is actually the daughter of Marvin Minsky, who many of you may have heard of. And in 1984 to 1989, she was experimenting in creating a force feedback joystick, which is the underpinning technology of haptic technology, which now is a part of all of the kind of game consoles and peripheral wearables that people have when they're playing games or engaging with virtual media, feeling surfaces and vibrations. It was her PhD at MIT that really underpinned some of that work, and it has received some recognition. So in his book Virtual Reality, Howard Rheingold met Margaret when she was experimenting with this and wrote some really lovely passages on what it was like for the first time to start to really feel surfaces through computational interfaces. So we had the video showing in the shop window, which shows her experiments with this, and if you look up Howard Rheingold's book and search for Margaret Minsky, you'll hear all about the work that she created. And then there's Tomiko Thiel, who's a really important person in virtual art and augmented reality creation. And actually her contribution goes back to designing the first ever supercomputer, the Connection Machine, which was actually under the supervision of Marvin Minsky. So there was a company called Thinking Machines Corporation. They were making the first ever supercomputer, and Tomiko was the first person ever to design a computer. Before this moment, they were just wires, cables, ugly looking pieces of machinery, and she's seated here here before the Connection Machine, which is now on display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, but it took a long while for that contribution to be recognised. And you can see in the Think Different campaign poster behind her there, she's wearing the T-shirt which shows her design. Richard Feynman is wearing that T-shirt in that advert, and Steve Jobs went on to produce the, while he was not at Apple, he was at Next. His first computer was a black cube, and Tomiko revealed that it was through a conversation with Joanna Hoffman, who worked with Steve Jobs, who was Tomiko's friend, that Steve had actually asked if Tomiko was available to design his next machine, and she wasn't, but he designed it in this image anyway. And so her contribution to computer design is a bit buried in the discourse of Apple and Steve Jobs, the genius. Why she's important to this talk, and this sort of segues me in, is that she also then went on to design the first ever virtual world for children in collaboration with Steven Spielberg in 1994, called Starbright World. Steven Spielberg entered the space as an avatar. He was E.T., his character from the famous film, and all the images you can see are avatars of children who were situated in various hospitals around the USA, unable to leave, and this was their way of communicating with others across this platform, and it was Tomiko who was instrumental in designing this. So she plays a really key part in virtual reality histories. So on to the main part of the talk, and this is what Manuel asked me to look at, understanding how virtual worlds can be understood and approached by screen arts, practice-based researchers and creative professionals. So I hope to do that in the next 30 minutes. And the 4 areas that I'm going to touch upon are the importance of real-time game engines to this landscape, and then through a case study of their application, through virtual production, through filmmaking in the metaverse, and then finally through immersive in-person experiences. So it's important first to look at the ongoing context of disruption and transformations that digital screen, media, film and cinema is experiencing. And these have been precipitated, as we know, by key moments. So potentially, absolutely, COVID-19 played a huge role in this. So prior to that, the sort of integration of digital film into the production workflow was already happening, and it was opening up new forms of digital distribution and access. So this manifested in streaming-only models, with Netflix debuting their first original film in 2015, which was Beasts of No Nation, and then other high-profile filmmakers following suit with Netflix first releases, including Roma by Alfonso Cuarón. Alongside this, virtual reality has been taking off, and so that's being used not as the main event, but as support for filmic text. So immersive technologies really opened up the space for audience engagement in 360-degree space around different film texts. There's some examples here. But really, it's still been a bit of a novelty sideshow. Virtual reality entertainment has yet really to find its own distribution and business model. So it remains a fringe activity, and it's still a question of whether this is still going to be a novelty in the entertainment world. Obviously, virtual reality does have utility in lots of other contexts, in health and training. It's taken off there, but as a main sort of entertainment experiential event, will it still be like 3D was in the 1950s, where it's more of a novelty to see the audience wearing these devices than actually engaging with the filmic content, which was considered very substandard in the 1950s, again in stereoscopic 3D's resurgence in the 1980s. And here you have a parody of that very same image with people wearing virtual reality headsets, and it's something that's kind of mocked or laughed at, that this is the way that people would want to experience this type of content, or sat isolated in one particular room. So that continues, and we continue to think about that. Other disruption, obviously, by the really rapid implementation of artificial intelligence in creative processes through generative AI, and models being trained by materials and copyright. And so the writer's strike that took place in response to this was a disruption in and of itself, and the ripple effect of that continues to be felt in the fact that everything had to grind to a halt. So in the UK in particularly, where there was so much production from America and Hollywood coming to a halt, there have been so many people out of work, losing their jobs, and it still yet hasn't picked up. So this is another ongoing transition. And this is a very recent article in the UK press, only published just last week, which shows that the UK film and TV studios that have been invested in because of this boom have actually been held back and stopped. So everybody's looking at this space with interest. Another disruption is the shift between cinema and high-end television content production. So looking at statistics, and this again is taken from the UK as an illustrative case, high-end television investment and production has overtaken film and cinema content production. So there's some data here which shows how there's been a shift in that investment and how the balance is tipped from one to the other. And this is also reflected in box office takings in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, where these still haven't reached 29 pre-pandemic box office levels. And independent UK filmmaking spend has also showed quite a significant downturn, a 31% decrease last year on 2021. So we're starting to see seismic shifts and changes in screen industries. Just using this as a case study, I'm sure there's similar reflections elsewhere. So the British Film Institute, in response, looking at their 10-year strategy, Screen Culture, are actually looking at the full breadth of screen storytelling, including video games. So it's a real clear statement here. The rhetoric is shifting from film and cinema culture into screen culture, and to be far more all-encompassing of the different modes and forms that may take. So on to real-time game engines then, and I know this is something that many of you will be familiar with. I visited the studio today, and the students I know are being trained in Unreal Engine. So these platforms really are challenging established platform companies and might even end up shifting the current power balance that exists between big tech platforms. Obviously, from a business perspective, game engines can set up environments and sets for prominent moves and TVs, but once they've been digitized, they can be ported to other media environments, including virtual reality, augmented reality. They could also be used in theme park design and virtual gaming environments. So they're really, really powerful in this space. They're also crucial components in the use of artificial intelligence, because they're used to look at providing safe environments to train and test AI-driven products, objects, and services. So one of the most prominent examples of this was the testing of driverless cars in virtual environments, which were developed by Unity. So the growing use of game engines, we just can't ignore it. This is the space that everybody's watching and looking at, and how things are developing. So this leads on to virtual production. This is what real-time game engines underpin. And in COVID-19, this area of innovation in the screen industry is absolutely accelerated. I think people often say it took 1 year to develop what would have normally taken 4 years to develop, but out of necessity, this had to be the case for productions to move into socially distanced spaces. So virtual production is an umbrella term that covers a suite of tools using real-time game engines across the entire film production chain. And I'll talk a bit more about what those are for those of you who are not familiar. But films like The Lion King, the television series like The Mandalorian, the third season of Westworld, His Dark Materials, have all been relying on games engines to create, or at least partially create, the virtual environments that the characters exist within. And of course, we trace this back. This isn't a brand new phenomena. It does have its roots in earlier experimental practice of machinima, the combination of the words machine and cinema, or animation, if you look at it as 3 words. And so these are using real-time computer graphic engines to create some form of cinematic production. And most often, these were used at the time in video games to generate an animation. Gamers were using it to track their gaming sessions and to show off and flex their abilities in the game environment. So particularly doing what were called speed runs in the 1990s through game platforms like Doom and Quake. And then it went on to actually develop storylines and narratives. So this was a real grassroots fan production, creating short film production. One of the earliest examples of this was A Few Good G-Men in 2005, which was a machinimatic reconstruction, shot for shot and word for word, of the court scene from A Few Good Men in 1992. So always important to look back at the antecedents, because virtual production comes with such hype and kind of, there's lots of buzzwords and lots of talk about it as being brand new and doing new things, but we have to understand that these were areas that others were experimenting in. And this is another person that I showcased in the Glow exhibition, Donna Cox, who in 1997 developed a piece of software called Virtual Director. And this was essentially a 360-degree wraparound collaborative real-time environment where they could work with other people using CGI generated imagery in these different spaces. So this was actually, you know, the first form of virtual production, which they didn't commercialize. She worked with her husband. They were just very interested in experimentation. And this was shown to Disney, and Disney, because it wasn't patented and they weren't interested in commercialization, obviously took it forward to underpin their own what are now virtual production systems. So going back to one of the first examples of where these different types of environments were created for filming, what are now called LED volumes or LED walls, was actually with the film Gravity. And what they wanted to create was a situation of realistic lighting that looked like lighting in a spaceship environment. So the performers were surrounded by LED panels which projected the imagery, so it reflected onto their helmets, so that they got these realistic renderings and more effective lighting qualities. And also the only real thing in those films that you can see of a person is the faces. Everything else is entirely computer generated. So they called this object Sandy's Cage. Cassandra Bullock inhabited it for most of the filming schedule. But it's since ramped up since that point that film was made, and now we're subject to these really quite extreme projections about how virtual production is going to grow. So significant growth in this area, we are told. So, you know, creeping up to the billions over the next 10 or so years. So just step back a bit for those that don't know, to explain a bit about virtual production, how it's driven by these real-time game engines. It's essentially when they're in these LED volume spaces driven by a technique that uses in-camera visual effects. So the LED volume is made up of many hundreds of LED panels that provide this huge screen that surrounds the production space or sound stage space, displaying a pre-built digital environment of computer-generated imagery most often. The cameras that are used are motion tracked in the space, and they're tethered to virtual cameras, and then that dynamically changes what is displayed on the LED screen to synchronously match the perspective and parallax with the physical camera records on set. So it's a technique that's often been called simulcam. And the actors perform within that space, within the LED volume that surrounds them, and they are also lit by it, and the digital environment is rendered in real time around them using real-time game engine technology. So this really changes and disrupts and upsets the production line in terms of things happening in at different points. So post-production really starting at the beginning of the process as opposed to at the end. And the benefits have been heralded as it's far more sustainable. There's far more creative control that the team can have over the images in the work. It enables iterative and collaborative development, and it reduces dependencies on location shooting and reduces dependencies on post-production at the end of the cycle. So there are cost savings and efficiencies that are seen with this mode of shooting, and it really kind of facilitates this cyclical mode of production. So this is something that I'd followed through an event and a project called The Future of Film, which we began in 2019. So it was before the pandemic, and it was just when real-time game engines were being spoken about, before this major acceleration. And we flagged some of those benefits at that point, that there'd be increased interdisciplinarity, there'd be environmental benefits, there'd be labour and resource efficiencies, and hopefully an increased diversity of storytellers, because it came with a promise that this would democratise filmmaking to some extent, because these tools were readily available for people to download, with both Unreal and Unity having free versions that you could use for free. But of course you have to have very large computing power, fast processing speeds, etc., for these to run effectively, so it doesn't really play out the democratization. But essentially these are 3D software platforms where environments can be built and manipulated. So there is early research to suggest the carbon footprint is much lower on a virtual stage compared to location shooting. There's still much research that needs to go into that to really understand the complexities of that and the waste that might be generated through digital technologies and their actual lifespan. But they do unarguably reduce waste generated in the process of making sets, and pre-visualization tools means that physical sets can be tested in virtual environments and adjustments can be made. So it reduces the waste of set materials. So it was when we wrote the report for 2021 that virtual production was completely accelerating because of COVID-19 and because of the technologies there. And John Gaeta, in one of our forums, who is the designer of the matrix bullet time and volumetric cinematography and universal capture, talked about us being in a crossfade moment, a moment of transition where we're moving from flat mediums into volumetric mediums, and how these environments would be built from the get-go. So we need to kind of start to think about what might be the challenges here, and there's obviously a lot of positive talk about this, but there's still lots yet to be understood because it's very early days. So The Mandalorian is always the one that's kind of flagged as the groundbreaking production that was used to shoot in virtual worlds, and kind of looking through the way that the shots are composited, you can start to see a sort of a standardization. You see lots of mid shots with performers' bodies hovering in the middle ground between busy foregrounds and detached backgrounds. So you have a detailed backdrop, which is showcasing all of these amazing CGI environments, but what you have is quite a standard conservative set of compositions there. And so you start to question if virtual production is going to generate homogeneous looking content that is all going to have a familiarity and an understanding that this is virtually produced, and there's a lack of creativity in the camera angles that can be achieved because close-ups could reveal the pixel pitch, which is the distance between the LED panels, which reveals aliasing and problems like that. So they can only really ever shoot within these environments at the moment in these mid-frame shots. So that's something to consider and to think about as we move forwards with this. This is the spinning LED volume that's been made as part of the Netflix 1899 film Inside Dark Bay. So again, this is signaled as quite an innovation where this was shot using this environment. So there's lots of investment, and we have to consider this and watch this space carefully. But I'll move on to 3 now, filmmaking in the metaverse. So the metaverse and spatial computing are a bit interchangeable. We're in this space where lots of buzzwords come in and out and fall out of fashion and use very, very quickly, and it can be confusing to understand, are these different things? Are these the same things? What are people talking about when they start to bandy around these words? So I prefer to kind of tie it down to virtual worlds. That makes more sense to me, and it's kind of in line with the trajectory of developments in this area and consistent with what I would understand how people describe a metaverse is actually at the moment a virtual world. And there's more kind of then ways to find academic literature and research into these areas, because this has been more the consistent term that's been used. So virtual worlds are essentially interactive simulated environments accessed by multiple users through an online interface. And this has been defined by the Virtual Worlds Review as having 6 essential features, which is a shared space with multiple users, a graphical user interface, immediacy, that it all happens in real time, interactivity, so that users can alter and develop the world, persistent, that it continues whether the individuals are logged in or out, and then a socialization or a sense of community. So for me, that really, really sums it up. And there is a consistency in people's definitions and viewpoints around what virtual worlds are through various different critics here. So many of the largest virtual worlds have been oriented towards children and teenagers. We saw that very early example that precedes these of Starbright World, made by Tomiko Thiel with Steven Spielberg. But following on from these, you've had platforms like Yville, Yo-Ho-Ho and Club Penguin. And then obviously Minecraft, which is a changeable virtual world launched in 2009, where players can build the space around them using a 3-dimensional grid. And then those that have been more targeted towards adults have been these open-ended virtual worlds, which started to come out in the early 2000s, like The Sims, There.com, and of course Second Life, the most prolific, which launched in 2003. And these were less about gaming mechanics being involved and more about social interactions. So sandboxes for play, engagement, and socialization. And then, of course, you have Epic Games' Fortnite that was released in 2017, which was a battle royale game, but actually what they then extended to was a party royale. So this was a kind of a non-combative game mode that they added in 2020, so players could interact with each other. There's been concerts that have played in there. You can watch feature-length films and engage with other avatars in that space. And so this is what happened during the pandemic, at which point social VR again really took off, with now many platforms that you can engage with. There's Meta Horizons, there's VR Chat, which is actually only available on the PC platform, but actually what you can do with VR Chat is experience it in full body VR, so you can use sensor technologies to map your movements onto your avatar. Decentraland was the first metaverse built on the blockchain, where purchases could be made using NFT, non-fungible token wallets. And then Microsoft-owned immersive social platform AltSpace VR, which closed down in 2023 without so much as a warning to the users, destroying all of the kind of the work and the worlds and the communities that had been built there. And that's obviously the risk with these platforms, with engaging in them and investing lots into them, but also trying to research them and capture them, is their ephemerality. So it's a difficult, challenging area of research. I myself have used Spatial.io. It's a browser-based WebGL application, and you can get it across web and mobile, PC and Mac. And it also includes filmmaking tools. So I'll show a little demo of something I've produced on that, because I think for practice-based researchers, these spaces are really interesting, and there are things that you can do in terms of ethnographies and observations and engagement with communities that you might not be able to reach in the real world. So these were all prolific in that time in 2021-22, but just stepping back to think about filmmaking in those spaces and what that has looked like or could look like. A series was created in Second Life in 2008 by Douglas Gayton called Molotov Alva and His Search for the Creator, A Second Life Odyssey. And this manifested as a 10-episode short video series. And it shows that it's sort of a documentary mode of a traveller called Molotov Alva who's been lost in Second Life. So he's left his real life home and he can only be found in this space. So it's a really interesting experimental moment of this field. Other films that have been made in these virtual spaces include Our Digital Selves, My Avatar Is Me, which was made in 2018. And that's a really interesting film. It chronicles the experiences and insights of disabled individuals using Second Life. And here there's a real advancement of filmmaking aesthetics, which merge real and virtual imagery within the virtual space. So it includes the avatars of the people being filmed, as well as themselves outside of that space. And then the first documentary to be shot entirely in a virtual world in the VR Chat platform was called We Met in Virtual Reality, and that was made in 2022. So the virtual world filmmaking techniques have really advanced significantly. If you watch this film, there's an in-world camera plugin called VC Lens, which attaches to the camera to the avatar so that they can go around and make different shots, and obviously people could collaborate in that filmmaking activity if you have multiple cameras capturing. So it's an area that's really interesting and one to think about, considering how you might produce films in that space. Then there's been other metaverse experiences that have been created by film and TV IP owners as part of the marketing campaigns of those properties in collaboration with different creative agencies. So you see the environment of the film or the TV program, whatever it is, being recreated in these spaces for audience members to go and engage. So the Meta's Horizon Worlds experience called Nope was based on Jordan Peele's film, and the experience includes a virtual train ride. Visitors can explore the cinematic world of the film through this space. They can play games and engage in various interactive elements. For the Netflix spy thriller, The Grey Man in 2022, this is hosted or was hosted in Decentraland, and users could go around a maze and gain rewards and kind of play within that space. And these are all temporally bound, so they no longer exist. So again, reflects that moment, that challenge that I mentioned, that it's really difficult to research and study these phenomena because they are only temporal and they are taken down or they disappear. And then there was another experience based around Ghosts, the comedy series, and you could win collectible NFTs in this particular space. So I'm going to move on to the final part now. So this is onto 4 immersive experiences. And this is why I got to thinking about the embodiment of these experiences. What happens to the real body in these moments, in these experiences? It's missing. How are senses being transformed? Is this the challenge of working in these spaces? So this looks back to some research that I did with my collaborator Helen Kennedy when we looked at live cinema, and we looked at immersive and what it might mean across these different contexts which spanned immersive media, which go from in-person mass attended events like those produced by an organisation in the UK called Secret Cinema, which are all about physical connection. You give up your mobile phone when you enter these experiences. It's not a digital experience in the moment. And the other end of that spectrum, solo virtual reality, and how the body in these spaces is treated differently, is experienced differently. And then there's lots of things in between. So Secret Cinema I've studied at length because they've really informed and underpinned how the immersive experience industry has been driven forwards in various areas of the global economy. They started in 2007 with very small guerrilla type screenings where people would buy a ticket, but they wouldn't know what film they were going to see. They wouldn't know where it would be. They were instructed to tell no one. So highly clandestine, secret events that traded on exclusivity and being in the know. And these soon grew to major events that had 400 people attend in some disused railway tunnels. They moved to major disused warehouse spaces that they then transformed into big cinematic sets that people would engage with for up to 4 hours or more, dressed as the character, engaging with actors and performances, big special effects and stunts. I think up to 4,000 people would be attending every night, and they were really making people stop and look because they were showing films that were back catalogue, old films. They weren't brand new releases, and they were breaking box office records. So weird things were happening in the box office charts, where Star Wars, the original Empire Strikes Back, was at the top of the box office ratings for that week in 2015, and the same with Back to the Future. They were breaking all of these box office records because their tickets sell for such a premium rate. They were sort of in the region of €80 for a ticket to attend one of these events. But what Secret Cinema have done is the people that have worked for them, the area that they work within, has really spawned a whole immersive economy, particularly in the UK, but in other places as well. And they've been recognised in these immersive economy reports, which study immersive entertainment across the world. And it now encompasses multiple genres that go across scare attractions, to escape rooms, to different themed attractions, to experiential art. So it's really kind of helpful to look at it in this way, because everything's being called immersive these days everywhere, whereas there are specific kind of characteristics that we sort of need to understand to believe whether it is one of these large-scale experiences. It really had a post-pandemic peak in 2019. Obviously, the pandemic was disastrous for this sector, and it's really not reached those pre-pandemic levels. But in 2022, these are just some of the experiences that were available to attend. Which work in the same way. They're attended by lots of people, lots of times they're dressed up. And then there's other experiences like art-based galleries, like the Van Gogh exhibition, which travels everywhere. There's multiple things. There's themed escape rooms. Secret Cinema still remain a kind of key influence in this and have exported their brand globally. So the last large-scale production they did in the UK was Casino Royale, which exported to Shanghai. And they've also moved into televisual content and also gaming content as well. So this reflects back to what I was saying at the beginning, that film and screen industries have really expanded to cover all areas, and they're really starting to converge in these different ways where there isn't really now a difference between those types of content for these types of experiences. So Secret Cinema have done game properties like Arcane, televisual properties like Bridgerton, and there's lots of copycat experiences now across televisual IP like Squid Game, more Stranger Things events, Money Heist, etc. And this also expands to Shanghai, where I visited recently, where they have a really big booming immersive economy. It's really popular as a form of entertainment there, and they recently had Three Body Problem as their latest experience there. So moving towards a close, and just to reflect back on the starting point of this talk, which was looking at the influence and impact of real-time game engines, and to underscore the point that I made, that from a business perspective, these are really challenging and disrupting what's happening in the screen industries, because you can create environments and sets for movies and TV properties, and these can then be ported into other media environments such as virtual and augmented reality, theme parks, virtual gaming environments, etc. So they're all pervasive, perhaps not necessarily democratizing in the way that it's been claimed due to computer processing power and accessibility and complexity, but they're certainly something that we all now have to consider as driving and shaping the industry as it goes forwards. So I'll just finish with a very brief piece of filmmaking that I undertook myself using the spatial.io platform. So this is actually showing you a 3D scan, which I could do on a free app on my phone, of the exhibition space of the Glow exhibition that I talked about. So we had pieces externally. This is the King's College London Strand campus in central London, pointing there towards what's called the Curiosity Cabinet, where we had the display of the different artifacts. And then along with one of the artists, Violetta Ayala, we created the exhibition space for visitors to come and visit from all over the world. Not everyone could get to central London, so we created this space, and were then able to have meetups with interested groups where the artists came in and they talked about their 3D creations, the work that they'd created and been involved in making. And this was a very quite easy to get through. I think it was a low barrier to entry compared to those bigger real-time game engines, which I think are prohibitively difficult if you're not properly trained and you don't have time. But you can very quickly spin something up in these virtual world spaces. You can bring people to the space, and then also you can capture and film. So this is just a very basic walk around that I did myself. But if you had multiple collaborators, you could shoot different camera angles, you could very quickly make a short film using these spaces and these tools where you can integrate 3D objects and real world scans. So I think my time is almost up. So there's the references. Obviously happy to share these with delegates afterwards, but I will leave it there. Thank you.
Right, really great, thank you. Questions? I think all range of topics have been covered. Maybe cover our eyes and make some light. Otherwise, I can't see the hands. Ah, you have a mic of your own. Yeah, Tobias.
Okay. Hey, thank you. That was super interesting. I think mine would be on one of the slides in the first third. There was written story first, format second.
Let me find it. So is it that one?
Like slide 10, 15 maybe. Yeah, here, yeah. No. Yes, here in the fourth paragraph, yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you, what does that mean?
Yeah, so that was an approach to how people kind of jump on these new technologies and think they have to make a a film or a story, or using these tools just because they're available, as opposed to really considering what the story requires. Not every film should be made using virtual production. As we've seen, it results in perhaps a homogeneous format. Not every story should be told using virtual reality. And so there's always a tendency for people to jump on these formats just because of their newness, to fetishize that and then not produce meaningful content. So it was an argument towards really considering which platform is going to tell your story the most effectively and the most that will connect with audience members most effectively.
Thank you so much. So many questions. Can I ask two, but I'll keep them really short. The first is to invite you to say more about what I took from the talk of the importance of returning to things like earlier 3D experiments, Second Life, Sims, machinima, and so on, where there was a lot of research probably at the time and then maybe forgotten, and now new work enters the field and could benefit from that. So really just an invitation to expand on that point, if I got it correctly. And the second, specifically on the last part of the talk, what your take is on, I suppose, audience willingness to pay for particular experiences and how they are, I guess, in competition with each other or in competition with other forms of leisure and entertainment spending, and what you might draw from both the emergence of different types of markets. So two unconnected questions, but so many. Thanks.
Thank you. So to go to the first then, obviously my research has always been focused on these moments of transition when new technologies come in and what happens in those spaces. And it was there that I discovered a real interest in how it was the marginalized voices that are then subsequently rewritten from history, because what those people are normally doing, they're normally from artistic backgrounds, so they're artists, so they're already not seen as credible as a technologist or a inventor, and very often, because they're open spaces where the rules haven't been established and they've yet to kind of inherit what are some of the problematic environments of mainstream media, like the games industries and the film industries, which can be very exclusionary. So you find a really diverse set of creative people working in those spaces and being the ones to innovate and really inform how the technology moves forwards by the content they create, by the stories that they want to tell. One of the people I didn't mention was Noni de la Peña, who's been dubbed the godmother of VR, but she worked on a project called Hunger in LA, which actually developed the first prototype for the Oculus Rift. It was her intern, who was Palmer Luckey, who went on to sell the Oculus to Facebook for eye-watering amounts. But it was through his collaboration with Noni that he evolved and developed that technology, because he could understand what it needed to do in a, an environment of creating empathy. And so, there's all of these stories that get overwritten, and it's a real challenge as technology now moves such a fast pace for academics and researchers to capture those moments and to understand it, who was involved and how those innovations came about before they're underwritten by the dominant narratives that our students uncover. And so it's a real that's why I'm so interested in those spaces, to understand what's really going on in them. But they become increasingly difficult to study when they're taking place in virtual space. So there isn't a tangible, outcome. With Noni, there was a headset that was produced. So you can see that what was there when it's digital, when it's code, it can be deleted at whim by the platform holders. There's no control that the users have over their data. It's all, as AltSpace showed, that was a terrible moment for those people who'd been using it as an artistic tool. So I don't know does that answer the question. And then for audiences, I studied this quite closely with Secret Cinema, because it was quite a phenomena that audience members would pay the equivalent of 80 to 100 euros for a ticket for a one-off event, and they were doing so in their thousands, to the point that it was generating this fast kind of box office. Wasn't generating any profit. The company didn't ever report a single profit, because the production cost was so high because of what they set out to achieve. But what it showed was that people were willing to do that, and I think that's why the industry looked at them, because people perhaps weren't willing for their one night out of the month to go to a multiplex and pay a premium price just to sit in a kind of a dull cinema, that they were perhaps saving for these one-off events that were far more special. And so that's why immersive and experiential, I think, has crept into the narrative of all these types of organizations, where they feel like they have to add more. There has to be added value for somebody to put their hand in their pocket to pay an amount to go out, because now they can access all of the content on their screens at home, on their devices. There has to be an incentive and an imperative. And I think Secret Cinema and organizations like that have really driven that. And of course, it's the same as a West End ticket. I think people perhaps rationalise it in that way. That's how much you'd go to see a theatre show. But they were offering these 4-hour in-depth experiences that would encourage people to go back again and again. So it's a really interesting economy, I think, but one that didn't quite, because of the disruption of the pandemic, you haven't seen that play out, because everything's obviously dipped with the spending crisis and cost of living and so on.
Thank you very much for this highway of a quick run through. There's like 2 questions that come up for me, because I think the basic notion you transmitted was the gamification of a lot of forms by these game engines, which is, I think, the core. Then you also show, because you talked about a kind of almost like a unification around that, like a new media unification about these immersive media, although they're, on the other hand, you show at least 10 different categories in the sense of liveness and different, the scary room and so on and so on. My question is, like, when you talked about the economy and you show the development, how do you see like this economy as, I would say, like almost like a gamification highway economy in relation to alternative forms that might not fall under the category you were showing now?
Yeah, interesting question, if I understand it correctly. So I think obviously there's a real kind of splintering, that kind of unification is balanced out by the huge amount and array of platforms that exist, for example, just in social VR. And that's always the discussion and challenge that accompanies those, is their lack of interoperability, that you can't buy something in one world, a new costume as an avatar, and take it into the next, because they're all separate. There's all of those kind of conflicts between platforms. But I think what the Epic Games platform, Unreal Engine, is doing is offering that opportunity for unification, and they sort of demonstrate it through their own platform of Fortnite. I think that's the kind of platform logic of that model, but I think what we're seeing is the opposite, which is the splintering of these different types of experience and exhibition. And it sort of links to that other question about, story first, format second. There are still so many different types of stories to be told, and they're not all going to suit one particular platform. There should be nuance to the mode that the viewers experience in it, whether it's through the mobile phone, whether it's through a TV screen, a large screen, a VR headset, an immersive experience. I think, they're all very, very different propositions and all have their own niche audiences as well. I think it's the IP and the commercial platform logic that this speaks to, that those things can be ported out, particularly franchise-based fan type texts which attract people to one particular IP is where that opportunity lies. But I wouldn't argue for or hope for a world where it's unified and homogenized. I hope that makes sense.
Sorry, 2 very brief questions. The first one starting with the crisis, because yesterday we discussed these figures, the slowness in Ireland, in the UK, in recovering to 2019 figures in theatre, in cinemas. My question is, do you see the opportunities that story worlds such as this ones present as a way forward in terms of the sustainability of the film industry? Or to put it differently, when you say story first, format second, because I remember when these reports came out, there was this discussion that we were talking of changing the value chain in producing in a single writer's room a format that could then be adopted to a lot of different platforms. But if I understood your argument correctly, what you're saying is that these worlds represent one of many opportunities for the cinema industry to continue to flourish. I just wanted to check if I understood it correctly. The second question has to do with Secret Cinema, the case study, because it's really interesting, but it was not viable from a business point of view. And there have been a lot of discussions on the issue of theme parks and solutions to, there's the famous example of the millions spent in Rome Reborn that never actually resulted in nothing because they were never able to put the theme park together. My question is, do you think that this mixture between a collective experience on a very grand scale, the idea that some have said that cinema will be watched in soccer stadiums because you need to have huge crowds and huge events, represents a way forward in terms of completing that diagram you had of the collective and the individual experience. And these virtual worlds will be the extreme in quality of the individual experience, but still audiences will strive for a collective experience that will be bigger and bigger and bigger, so to say, in a certain sense.
Yeah, interesting question. I'll come to the second one. There's a lot there to hold in. I think the acceleration of all of the uses of virtual worlds and these technologies was about, it was responding to the pandemic and for connection. So I don't think people were just going to digital spaces because they wanted to be in a digital space. They were going there because they wanted to connect with others and, socialize and be with one another, which I think is why those immersive in-person experiences are so popular, why they were so popular. But you're right, in the scalability, at both ends of the scale have problems. The virtual reality solo use still hasn't found a place or a business model that's effective. And then these larger scales not turning a profit, they've been sort of diminished or reduced or made more efficient. And I think actually the example that I showed in Shanghai, which is based, the organization are called Puy de Fou, and they have theme parks in Europe, one in France. They were just building this one on the left in Shanghai, and we went to have a look at it before it opened. And they're obviously highly lucrative in China, and particularly in Shanghai, because they've automated everything. So I was asking them about the costs of running it, and they said, well, we don't have any technical support needed because the lighting is automated, the sound cues are automated, the special effects are automated. There's just so many actors that they're paying, and obviously actors don't come at a really expensive rate. They're not famous people, and so they just, I think, have like, I don't know, 1 or 2 people on a desk in security to make sure they're safe. But they've got it to a point where they've saved on labour costs, and anyway, labour costs in Shanghai are notoriously lower elsewhere, and so they have cracked that model because they have multiple spaces like this cropping up all the time. They build them from the ground up within weeks, so obviously it works there. But I think it's going to be very difficult for established creative industries to accept that kind of model or that kind of work in other domains. So yeah, it's a really interesting case in point that it's obviously very different in different geographic regions and international countries. Going back to the first part of your question is, I've forgotten it now, so you could very quickly. Yes, yeah, and is also economically viable. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because it is, branded as an economic mode of production. It's making cost savings in terms of travel, in terms of labour, and I'm sure with artificial intelligence, they too will be automating lots of the processes that are currently, human-led. So I think that is obviously the next leap that will be made, and I think that will be what the industry will look towards, which isn't it's a bit dystopian, isn't it, to think about this, but so much will become automated by necessity because of the economic models needed. So it's not quite about the audience access that you mentioned there. It's more of an answer relating to production logics.
Right. Being mindful of the time, this really has to be the last question.
I'll try to be very short. Thank you so much. This was super fascinating. I had other questions, but I will focus in the main topic, the story part of it. I noticed that in the Virtual Worlds journal, no mention of narrative or story was there. And we know from previous eras of the immersive virtual craze, media novelty had a hard time transitioning to having a function, actually being innovative in terms of telling stories and going past that amazement with the technology. Do you see a link there, or can we talk about the narrative aspect of this extended reality technologies? Is it a challenge? How do you see it going?
Yeah, really, really interesting question, and a good spot there to see that that wasn't mentioned in that particular definition of virtual worlds. But of course, there have been lots, and this is because of the challenge of distribution models being missing and business models not there to get these virtual reality, virtual world projects to large audiences. As part of the Glow exhibition, we curated 12 virtual reality stories, which were all really wonderful. They were all really engaging. The audiences that came to see them were blown away. Basically, they're all made by women or collaborations with women, telling different stories from different perspectives of areas and places that people would never understand or issues that they'd never heard about. And told through this medium was highly, highly effective. And that's the sadness of it, is that those don't get to big mass audiences because of the limitations of the form, and we ourselves were constrained by, you only get one person in a headset to watch a 30-minute experience over the course of an 8-hour day. You can only get 16 people through. So these audiences are minor, but the productions, in their investment, in the time that they've taken, and in terms of the incredible stories that are told, are not reaching audiences for there to be an appreciation of how powerful this medium can be. And it's a challenge yet to be cracked.
Yeah. Could you elaborate a bit on the part where this might be have the potential to disrupt workflows? These new technologies, I just saw a video from the production of Fallout, where they built virtual sets and they walked around in them with VR glasses, and they could kind of block the scenes and learn how they should build the sets using these technologies. What are the potentials to disrupt what is a pretty conservative industry?
Yes, yeah, and that was a method I think they used for was it The Lion King or one of those earlier films where they did set recce's, they built the world and the plains of Africa for the crew to perambulate, as you say, with VR headsets, so they could block out and map the shots and create them. So that obviously upturns location filmmaking practices where the real world location is no longer needed, and that obviously negates the need for some of the labor roles, practices, processes on set. And I think it's probably artificial intelligence that's going to be more disruptive than virtual production, because this has been coming for a while and there's been gradual adaptations, and like we've mentioned, it's only perhaps certain films like sci-fi that are suitable for virtual production stages anyway, because they can only deal with certain kinds of lighting. They can't ever be fully lit because you can't get full sunlight qualities through the LED panels. And so I still think that that's one pathway and one form of disruption that's happening there. But yeah, it's interesting to think about. But I think AI, as I mentioned, is already, editing. There's AI editing systems that through training can predict when cuts would normally happen, particularly in trailers. They're now being used. AI is now being used to cut trailers because there's such a rhythm, there's such a formula that they can learn that they're actually can be quite effective. So it's a labour-saving cost being made there, and forms of compositing and VFX work that was normally manual labour in digital sweatshops is being automated. And I think that will play out across lots of aspects of the production workflow. And it's already happening.
Right. So the endless, non-stop row of questions shows the value of your work and the excitement that this talk has caused, and the importance of this topic at our current times. So I would like us all to thank Sarah for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thanks.